and humanists of our time. The modern, unbelieving secularists and humanists of our time. They believe that Christianity is the great danger to freedom and good government.
People who reject the very word of God, people who reject the very word of God, people who reject the very word of God.
Welcome to Freethinking 101, brought to you by the Rationalist Society of St. Louis. Tonight we are once again honored to have as our guest Jeff Hornback. Last time Jeff was a guest on our program, I spent so much time noting his numerous honors and accomplishments that I ran short of time at the end of the show. So this week I think I'm just going to suffice it to say that Jeff is the former leader of the Ethical Society here in St. Louis. He holds a PhD in philosophy from Columbia University. He's a charter member of the American Humanist Association and is also a member and local secretary for Americans United for Separation of Church and State. Welcome to the show, Jeff.
Thank you.
Jeff, tonight...
Glad to be back.
Well, thank you.
All right.
Tonight we're going to talk about religion and law in the United States. I guess one convenient place to start anyway, although it's certainly not the absolute beginning, but a convenient place to start in the discussion of that topic is the Declaration of Independence. What mention did the Declaration of Independence make of anything in any way associated with religion?
Well, people these days are always citing precedents in religion and misinterpreting them mostly, by the way. So the first and best early document for that purpose is the Declaration of Independence, which Thomas Jefferson wrote, 1776. We've already celebrated and passed by several years the bicentennial of the American independence. But Jefferson used words that have meaning if they're understood in the context of deism, the Enlightenment, the new scientific philosophy that most of the educated people in that day were following. And so when he spoke in the Declaration of Independence, of all men being created equal and being endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and then when he went on to refer to the laws of nature and of nature's God, those phrases are just dead giveaways that this was a deist speaking. And for those to whom these terms are unfamiliar, a deist is a person who doesn't believe in a personal God, but uses the God language to refer to whatever it was way, way back that created this great natural universe and then left it to run according to natural scientific laws. That roughly is what deism was all about. And that was the philosophy of Jefferson and Madison and Franklin and Paine and Washington to a certain extent, though Washington wasn't any great intellectual. Many of the signers of the Declaration and many of the people who went on to form the Constitution of the United States were deists. And unless you understand that distinction, the words they use don't have their true and intended meaning.
Yeah, I understand that there's the subject often comes up about what frame of mind the writers of the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence were in when they used these terms. There's oftentimes argument about whether this person believed in God, I guess is usually the way the question is posed, or whether he didn't. And I guess you really have to put yourself in sort of a, become more familiar with the zeitgeist of the Enlightenment to really understand these types of terms like creator. These were really very common terms that were used at the time to express ideas that were subtly different from the way that they're interpreted now.
Yes. Well, Thomas Paine, who was the chief pamphleteer, the chief writer for the American Revolution, might surprise people in his Age of Reason. He said, I believe in one God. But by the one, then he proceeds to say he doesn't believe in revealed religion. He doesn't believe in superstitions and myths and that sort of thing. His was the God of the world of science, somehow that far-off divine event way back there that got things started. We might speak today of the Big Bang. Is that a God Well, I don't think so, but they used God as a kind of a shorthand for the area before science was able to take over.
Yes. Well, you know, that sort of reminds me of a quote by Ingersoll. I can't give you precisely, but he said something to the effect that as religion evolves, or each succeeding religion has less myth and more science, and the ultimate result of this will be that religion will be indistinguishable from science. And I guess that's what they had in mind during the Enlightenment, and they would use terms like God and like Creator to really express ideas which weren't totally incompatible with a scientific view of the world, or with a mechanistic view of the world even.
Well, as I said, this spirit of the Declaration carried on through the Constitutional Convention, which wrestled for many months with writing a constitution, which was finally produced in 1887. So it's 11 years later. And there was a controversy in the Post-Dispatch not long ago after the Washington Post columnist, whose column runs in the Post every now and then, Edwin Yoder, he ran a column explaining that you had to understand these documents, the Declaration and the Constitution, in terms of the deist philosophy of the Founding Fathers. And a couple of people picked him up on that, and they listed the religious affiliations. Why there were so many Episcopalians and so many Methodists, wouldn't have been Methodists at that time, whatever. Lutherans, in other words, they named the different, so many Catholics in the Constitutional Convention. Well, the simple fact was, most of these people remained nominally Christian. In other words, they belonged to the churches, most of them. Only a few abstained, like Tom Paine and others who wouldn't join a church. Abe Lincoln later on wouldn't join a church. But Washington was a member of the established church, largely because it was established, even though it was disestablished soon after.
Well, it's a very important social institution.
Yeah, that's right. It was an institution in the community, and they rationalized that the term God could be shifted and applied to whatever they regarded as of supreme importance or supreme power in the universe. And so the Constitution, much as people would like to find religious precedent in it, has very little. Do you know what the Constitution says about religion?
Well, it has some prohibitions about government's involvement with religion. I guess that's
the only thing that the Constitution of the United States says about religion is that there shall be no religious test for public office. Now, people might say, and they're not even aware that this is in the Constitution, they might say, yes, but what about the oath of office that every president from Washington on up through George Bush has taken, ending so help me God, and placing a hand on the Hebrew Christian Bible. That's not in the Constitution. The Constitution says the president, before executing the powers of his office, shall take the following oath or affirmation. And oath and affirmation are capitalized, the first letters. The following oath or affirmation. And it starts out, I solemnly swear or affirm, and that's in parentheses. Now, unfortunately, no president, to my knowledge, has ever chosen simply to affirm. They've all saying, I solemnly swear, because people of conscience have often refused to take the oath. Quakers, for instance, freethinkers always, they choose to affirm, and everybody ought to know that's their legal right in any court or any legal procedure in these United States. If somebody throws a Bible in front of you and asks you to take a theological oath, you can say, I choose to affirm. But even those presidents and other officers who took the full oath said nothing about God. It was a purely secular promise to uphold the Constitution of the United States. Presidents have simply added their own religious understanding, or the administering judge. Frequently it's the supreme judge, the justice of the Supreme Court, you see, who administers the oath, and he will say, "So help you God," or something, and place your hand on the Bible. That is not in the U.S. Constitution at all.
Well, those are what I like to call factoids. That's things that strongly resemble fact and maybe are even accepted as facts, but aren't really facts. So so really in the Constitution itself, that's the only mention of religion then. No, but now if we get into the Bill of Rights, there's...
Well, it was perceived that the Constitution said an awful lot about these responsibilities of people, what Congress shall do, what the President shall do, how the electoral vote shall be taken, and so forth. But it didn't say much about the individual rights of people. And so at the same time, in 1887, there was circulated amongst the states, and I believe it took 2 or 3 or 4 years for enough of them to ratify it. But in that same year, 10 amendments, which are called the Bill of Rights. And the First Amendment is the one that is the most important now in terms of its religious implications. And, you know, the phrasing of that, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Then it goes on, or prohibiting freedom of speech or the right to assemble and that sort of thing, or the press. But the important religious clauses are the first two. They shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. That was because a number of the states, including Virginia, from which Washington came, had an established church. Massachusetts had established the Congregational Church, which oddly enough became so Unitarian. About half the Congregational churches became Unitarian, which was an embarrassment to the original intent. When your established church goes liberal, what do, you know? So they got rid of the establishment. That was the way they solved that in Massachusetts. But this applied to the federal government. It could not establish any religion. And that's the basis of most cases ever since the Establishment Clause.
Well, you know, now, if I could take the devil's advocate, be the devil's advocate for a second here and just say, well, the people that tend toward more involvement of government in church affairs would say that the First Amendment really is just a prohibition against the preference of one religion over another religion. They'd say that when the Constitution and the Bill of Rights was being written, they had a real mulligan stew of religion, sort of like we do today, really, no different. But everybody was afraid that the other person's religion was going to get the upper hand. And that's really the problem they were trying to address when they wrote the First Amendment. It's sort of like saying you shouldn't prefer dogs. Now, when you say you shouldn't prefer dogs, does that mean you shouldn't prefer dogs over cats, or does that mean you shouldn't prefer Doberman Pinschers over German Shepherds? Maybe there's a...
Well, this is still much debated, and it's not too different from the days in which these deist founding fathers lived. There were, in most of the colonies, dissenters, nonconformists. Frequently, they had been relegated to second-class citizenship or no citizenship. Often, nobody but a Christian, for instance, or sometimes nobody but a Protestant, or sometimes nobody but a Catholic, by the way.
That must have been a rare instance.
Yeah. Well, Lord Baltimore, we know, founded the state of Maryland, but he did grant religious toleration to other religions because Catholics had been put down in most of the colonies, as had Jews, as had atheists. But Thomas Jefferson and Madison and Franklin and those other people who did our documents were very clear. It made no difference to them whether you were a Baptist, a Lutheran, a Catholic, a Jew, an atheist. There should be no religious test for public office or for exercising your citizenship. And that's the way it should stand. And these people who go around quoting Jefferson, you know, the laws of nature and nature's God, as proving we're one nation under God, which has been added in recent years, by the way. That wasn't in the early documents. Fairly early, it got on some of our currency, "In God We Trust." And Teddy Roosevelt, at the turn of the century, objected to that. He said, kind of sacrilegious to put that on money. He wanted it taken off. And he said, every time we take it off the money, some damn fool in Congress, and these were Teddy Roosevelt's words. He was a theist, he was a believer, but he regarded that kind of phrasing as having nothing to do with officialdom in government. And you want to talk about some more of these precedents on under God?
Yeah, well, this is really, I'm sure, a revelation to many people that...
it came late. It came late.
Well, even the Pledge of Allegiance was modified to suit the...
Well, I'm a little vague on the date that the pledge became an official part of our government. I think it was after I was in grade school. I'm not sure. I was in grade school in the late 20s and early 30s, and high school, the late 30s. I don't remember ever saying that. I learned the Pledge of Allegiance somewhere along in there when it came in. But it was an unofficial document which had appeared in Youth's Companion. It was called the Youth's Companion Pledge to the Flag in 1892. And it was tossed around, promoted for years before it was finally accepted officially. And it said, "One nation indivisible with liberty and justice for all." And the author, by the way, was a clergyman. He didn't see the need for putting "under God." But in 1954, after an ardent campaign, some people pressured Congress into putting the phrase "under God," one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. So anybody who quotes that precedent has got to recognize that that precedent was created contrary to the wishes of its original author in 1954.
Well, I guess in establishing that modification to the Pledge of Allegiance, the Congress showed a little bit of preference to religion and to a certain specific view of religion.
Well, remember, that was in good President Ike Eisenhower's administration, and I liked Ike. Most people did. He was a wonderful guy. He was convinced, and he said, everybody ought to have a religion, and I don't care what it is. Now, maybe Ike would have been a little bit shocked at secular humanism, which even the conservatives are now declaring is a religion or a religious position. And I would be inclined to say, if you want to characterize it as a religious position, it may be a negative position in the eyes of most people, but it is a religious position, and it's entitled to equal rights. So that was the background of that, the Eisenhower administration of civil religion. Everybody ought to have a religion, I don't care what it is. You paid your respects to the God of your choice and then went down to the business at hand.
Yeah, yeah. Well, you know, there's been recently, I guess, just maybe about a year ago, I think, in the news, there was sort of an uproar involving Sandra Day O'Connor, and this wasn't in her official capacity, but she apparently did some research to demonstrate or provide evidence to the effect that our country was a Christian nation and had been proclaimed so by various court decisions. And she dredged up several very obscure passages from several court decisions which made reference to us being religious, certainly, and being religious people, and being references to our Christian character. And this has been something that people have tried to use as sort of a lever, this whole idea that it's a religious nation, and beyond that, a Christian nation quite often, to promote certain philosophical...
Well, you notice she has been a little embarrassed by that and has tried to back out of it. It happened when the Republican State Committee of Arizona, I think it was. Is that her home state?
Yeah.
I think it was her home state.
Governor
I think
Meacham
it was
State.
Arizona.
Governor Meacham State.
Yes, Governor Meacham State, yeah. A fine, sterling character and a true believer. But she has had to admit that though she found those passages and gave some aid and comfort to this committee, that this was not to be taken as a ruling by the Supreme Court. There are a lot of those phrases that have occurred in minor passages or in footnotes in Supreme Court decisions that don't really have the effect of law. And certainly, though you can find in the law statements to the effect that, America is a religious nation or America is a Christian nation even, you couldn't get the court by a majority vote to sustain that point of view, and that's what really counts in the law.
Well, it's also, I guess, important once you become familiar with how these decisions are written. Quite often they may be the opinion of even just one judge who
That's right.
happens to write the decision, and there's politics that go on there on courts, where a number of judges sit. They're not going to wrangle over some point that really is ultimately meaningless or should be meaningless in terms of the interpretation of the law or the application of the law.
Well, even the late Justice William O. Douglas, who's anathema to most conservatives because most of his opinions were very liberal, he said in one court case, America is a religious nation whose laws presuppose belief in a supreme being. And this shocked a lot of people. But it certainly was one man's opinion, and it does not have the effect of law of requiring every citizen or every government unit to enforce a belief in a supreme being. I was surprised and shocked when that was attributed. Similarly, I think it was Douglas, maybe in the Roy Turcaso case about the atheist notary public in the state of Maryland, who in a footnote said, in addition to the traditional theistic religions, and by the way, theism is the opposite of the deism of the founding fathers. Theism is a belief in a personal God, a real God, I would say, God of thunder and power and will and consciousness. He said, in addition to the theistic religions, there are several religions that do not have a God concept, and he named Buddhism and ethical culture and secular humanism. So gleefully, most of the right-wingers who would enforce fundamentalism on our country say, well, secular humanism as a religion, and therefore, if we can find any traces of secular humanism in the teachings of the schools, evolution or the right to abortion, these aren't characteristically secular humanist documents, though many humanists would believe in these matters. So they say that proves that the Supreme Court has declared secular humanism, or rationalism as in the Rationalist Society, to be a religion. It did nothing of the sort. It's a footnote in a case by a particular judge writing his own opinion. It wasn't the majority opinion even. It was one man's opinion written in the court. Now, oddly enough, these things do become in people's minds precedents for future action. And it will probably be true. There was the Seeger draft law case right around World War II when a young man named Seeger, who didn't believe in God, was nevertheless a conscientious objector. And the court ruled that a belief in God or in some principle or cause taking the place of God in the mind of the believer, that was justification for conscientious objection. Well, I was that kind of conscientious objector in the early years of World War II, even before the case was settled. Though after the war started, I gave up my conscientious objection, decided war was inevitable to stop Hitler.
Yeah. Well, it's funny because when they talk about secular humanism and they try to tie some of the scientific areas that very conservative religionists have a problem with, like evolution, back to secular humanism and claim that somehow evolution has some religious taint to it. It's, by that broad definition, auto mechanics could be tied to secular humanism or cooking. I mean, there's about as much a close relationship there between evolution and...
I like your British pronunciation of evolution. I called it evolution, whichever you call it. Most mainline religious people believe in evolution now. A lot of them will take the dodge, well, evolution is the way God chose to create life and the species. Only very conservative people, pre-scientific types really, that believe that evolution is not
Yeah.
true in some, granted they don't have all the missing links, never will, probably. And there are quarrels amongst the evolutionary scientists, which these conservatives take advantage of. They say, see, so-and-so disagrees with so-and-so. Well, sure, evolutionists, being scientists, argue about finer interpretations of the theory.
Well, I guess the major distinction between evolutionists and creationists seems to be that the creationists seem to start with their conclusion and work back to,
Yeah.
Dig up evidence, whatever they can throw together to try to support that conclusion, whereas the evolutionists work the other way around.
Yeah.
But could we talk for a moment about the concept of accommodation of religion? It seems that one of the major...
The free exercise clause, you mean?
Right. That seems to, for a
Yeah.
long time, that set the limit, the border beyond which government could not go. It could accommodate the practice of religion, but not encourage or inhibit it.
Well, I'm tempted, if they include everybody, to say, sure, go ahead. I know for years, religious organizations have been tax exempt, for instance, but so have educational and philanthropic organizations. And it's interesting for us here in Missouri that the old Constitution of Missouri, which was supplanted somewhere in the late 1940s, was one of the strictest in separation of church and state in the whole country. Not one penny, said that Constitution, could ever be expended for the benefit of religion, and that was interpreted to include tax exemption. So the Bishop of St. Louis in the Roman Catholic Church incorporated an educational and philanthropic organization in order to get his tax exemption. And that's the way the churches got their tax exemption until the new Constitution came in the late 1940s. Even the Ethical Society, long before my years of leadership here, which began in 1951, ran through the middle 80s, the Ethical Society accepted tax exemption on the grounds that if these conservative groups in the religious area are going to get it, then ethical societies and humanist groups and rationalist societies and atheist groups, Madeleine Murray O'Hair got tax exemption on the grounds that it would be unconstitutional to discriminate against her by giving the Orthodox tax exemption and denying it to her. And I think she's right.
Yeah, well, that would be a pretty obvious case of discrimination.
It would, yeah. So if you're going to accommodate, if you're going to be helpful, then you got to be helpful to all. You've got to be even-handed. You can't say we're going to subsidize the conservatives and penalize the liberals or the dissenters. That isn't the American way.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Well, I guess the accommodation basically then, would you say, is limited to removing, I think they say, removing the burden of the practice of religion. The state cannot place a burden on someone for practicing their religion.
That's
and
right.
That's what they mean by accommodation.
That's right.
Well, it's been fun, Jeff. I really learned a lot tonight about the relationship between the state and church and how, the background of the formation of the state's approach to its dealings with religion and churches. And I hope our viewers have picked up a few interesting things, too. If they would like to write any questions or suggestions about future program ideas or comments on this program, they can write to the Rationalist Society of St. Louis, Post Office Box 2931, St. Louis, Missouri 63130. Thanks for joining us tonight, and be sure to write.